All right, this story is, it's by a man named Paul Mahoney, and I got the story from Chicken Soup for the Soul. I think it was the second Chicken Soup for the Soul. And it's called The Shoes. The 1930s, the decade of the 30s, was really a bad time economically all through the United States. Of the people that wanted to work, there were more than 25% that couldn't find work. Men walked the streets, they walked the roads, they walked and hitchhiked on the highways, they rode the freight trains, going, always looking for work. Any work would do, sometimes for almost no wage. Sometimes just a meal or two and a barn or a shed to spend the night in. I think the hardest hit were the small manufacturing towns and the small mining towns, like the one where I grew up in western Pennsylvania. Now, my family wasn't that bad off. It was a large family, but there was always food on the table when we sat down for a meal. But usually our stomachs were still empty when our plates were empty. Let me go through that again. There was always food on the table, but our plates were usually empty before our stomachs were full. All right. But, you know, it was really difficult to get clothes. Now, since I was the youngest boy in a large family, all of my clothes were hand-me-downs, clothes that had been altered, maybe more than once, with patches on them, and sometimes there were patches on the patches. But the most difficult item to get was shoes. We wore our shoes until they'd been half-soled at least 2 times, until there were splits in the rotten uppers that showed our feet. I remember as vividly as if it were yesterday the shoes I was wearing the day that the box arrived from my sister. The soles were loose and they slapped when I walked. I got a couple of rubber bands from an old inner tube and wrapped them around the ends of the shoes to try to hold them together. And I put cardboard in them as insoles, trying to keep my feet off the cold ground. You could see my bare feet through the splits in the rotten leather. Now, my oldest sister, in fact she was the oldest sibling, was married, and she and her husband lived in Colorado. And from time to time, she would send us a box with some of their discarded clothes, or clothes she gathered from neighbors and friends. Now, this box arrived just before Thanksgiving. My mother put it on the table, and we all stood around the table watching. She carefully untied the binder's twine that held it together, opened the box, and there, nestled neatly among the neatly folded clothes, were the shoes. Now, none of us at that time knew what kind of shoes there were. We just assumed that there were some that my sister had gotten tired of and sent on to us. My mother picked them up and held them. They were made of shiny tan leather. They had longish pointed toes and medium-high heels. My mother looked around at all of us, and then she reached the shoes out to me. Well, I put my hands behind my back and took a step backwards as tears began to well up in my eyes. My mother put her arm around me and tried to comfort me. She said, "Son, winter's coming. You can't wear the shoes you have. You have to have some shoes." And this is all we have. Please try to make the best of it. Well, I took the shoes from her, but I didn't try them on until I had a chance to be alone that evening. My father didn't say anything, but he patted me on the head. And my favorite brother ruffled my head and said, everything will be all right. Well, the next morning, I procrastinated as long as I could before getting dressed to go to school. And at the last minute, I put on those hated shoes. They were comfortable, and they fit me all right. But as I looked down on them, tears dripped onto the shiny tan leather. Well, I put on my coat and I went out the door and I walked the back way to school, hoping not to meet anyone. And I didn't. But when I got to the back gate of the schoolyard, who do you suppose was there? It was Timmy O'Toole, my only enemy. Now, Timmy and I were both in Miss Miller's class, but he was a lot taller than I was, and a lot stronger, and at least a year older. He took one look at my shoes and said, Evan's got girls' shoes. Girls' shoes, girls' shoes. Look at Evan's girls' shoes. Well, he grabbed me by the arm and pulled me into the schoolyard, chanting, girls' shoes, girls' shoes. And immediately a ring of boys formed around us. And he kept chanting, taunting, girls' shoes, look at Evan's girls' shoes. Well, I felt like I could have mashed his face. But he was so much bigger than I was and stronger. All I could do was stand there and let the tears run down my face. Then a man's voice said, all right, boys, break it up. It's almost time for the tardy bell. Get to your classes. Well, it was old man Walker. He was our principal. None of us boys liked old man Walker. He had a reputation for being mean. And, of course, he favored the girls. Well, I jerked loose from Timmy and ran for the building. I went into Miss Miller's classroom and sat down at my desk. I drew my feet up under them as far as I could, trying to hide those hateful shoes. But it didn't do much good. Every time that Timmy get a chance that day, that morning, he'd come by and whisper, girls' shoes, girls' shoes. Well, later that morning, Miss Miller was teaching us about the winning of the West, about places like Oklahoma and Texas, New Mexico and Colorado, how the pioneers traveled, how they walked or rode horses or got pulled in carts with oxen or wagons with horses. It was interesting. It was the most interesting lecture I've ever heard. And while she was talking, the door opened, and in walked old man Walker. He shut the door and leaned up against the wall and just listened while Miss Miller talked. After a while, Miss Miller said, Mr. Walker, do you have anything to add to this discussion? Well, he did. Believe me, he did. Now, until that time, none of us knew that as a young man, he had worked on a ranch in Oklahoma. And he told us stories about life on the ranch as a cowboy. He talked about mending fences and building fences and branding cattle, sorting cattle, taking them to sale, the mending of the saddles and other leather goods at night in the bunkhouse, playing poker and playing jokes on each other. He even sang us a couple of real old cowboy songs. And believe me, that man could sing. Well, after a while, Miss Miller said, well, it's time for you to put your materials away. girls and boys. It's almost time for lunch. Well, old man Walker walked down the aisle beside my desk, stopped when he got there, and looked down at my feet. I looked up at him and I pulled my feet back up under my desk. And he said, "Cowboy Oxfords? Evan, where did you get those cowboy Oxfords? Those are the best genuine cowboy Oxfords I've seen since I was in Oklahoma." By then, the other students were coming around to look at my cowboy Oxfords. And I put my feet out so they could see them better. I was proud of them now. And they came around and said, "Look, Evan's got genuine cowboy Oxfords." Well, some of the kids said, "Can I try them on?" And I said, "Well, I'll have to think about that. After all, these are special shoes." So Miss Miller said, "It's time to go." So I had trouble getting out the door. Everyone wanted to walk beside me. So I got outside and I went home, ate some cornbread and a bowl of greens that my mother had for me, some beans. Then I went back to school, but I didn't go into Miss Miller's classroom right away. I first stopped at Mr. Walker's office. You see, he was no longer old man Walker to me. He was now Mr. Walker. So I went in and he said, "Hi, Evan, how are those cowboy Oxfords doing?" And I said, "Just fine, Mr. Walker. I want to ask you a question." He said, "Okay, go ahead." And I said, "Do you think it would be all right if I let the other kids try on my cowboy Oxfords?" And Mr. Walker put his hands behind his head and leaned back in his chair and took a while thinking. And then he said, "Evan, I think it would be all right to let the boys try them on, but not the girls. You see, girls should never wear cowboy Oxfords." Well, that pleased me because that was just exactly the way I felt about it. Well, I did let the other boys try them on, and even Timmy O'Toole, but I made him wait till last. And he is the only other one that they fit. You know what that rascal had the nerve to do? He asked me to write to my sister and ask her if she could find a pair of cowboy Oxfords for him. I didn't do it, though. You see, I had the only pair of cowboy Oxfords in town, and that's just the way I liked it.